we all know that people are suffering from a deteriorating economy and facing rising healthcare costs, tuition costs, transportation, gasoline costs, everything. People are struggling. What we need in this country, and we've had it and we need to get back to it, is a prosperity that is shared by all of us. The first thing we need to do to get back on track is we have to make different choices, bring our troops home from Iraq, and stop spending $12 billion a month overseas, bring that money where we need it at home. Second, we have built up a huge debt over the last 7 years that George Bush is responsible for and Frank Wolf has supported. We need to restore fiscal responsibility to this country, use our resources widely. We need to invest in our future. We need to invest in our infrastructure as part of our transportation system and our thriving economy. And we need to invest in education, education, education. What we need is a fundamental change in our priorities to make the right choices for all our citizens to get our economy back on track.
Thank you. Well, my opponent just said we need prosperity, we need the Iraq war to end, we need fiscal responsibility, we need to invest in our future, we need education. I think we all agree on that. What I would do about the economy is housing. The economic crisis right now is fundamentally a housing issue. We must solve the housing crisis. H.R. 3221 was passed in the House yesterday. It had 3 amendments. Frank Wolf voted against 2 of those 3 amendments. I personally worked on the housing counseling portion of that bill for the last 2 years. It is absolutely vital that this legislation be passed. And the only way we will pass it is not with bipartisan cooperation, though I am perfectly willing to be a bipartisan and to cooperate. The Republicans have no vested interest in this Congress in passing that legislation, which is why Frank Wolf voted against it. That provision, 3221, has precisely the recommendations that I put into my housing and economics paper on my website on March 9th. Refinance these loans at a deep discount to lenders. They hurt a little bit. Enter a shared equity arrangement with home buyers that refinance with a government-insured loan. They hurt a little bit. Stabilize the housing market, and that stabilizes the credit market. The pilot light of the current crisis that we are in is the housing problem. We must pass 3221. We will only do that if we have a veto-proof majority in both houses. We must elect Democrats in 2008. Well, I just came out of the nation's largest nonprofit credit counseling network for the past 3 years. I have sat in on and listened to people with serious debt. Education is clearly at the heart of it. I worked for Junior Achievement before that, and I specifically remember a time when the kids couldn't understand when I told them my salary, how I could possibly use up all that money in 1 month. I mean, they were pretty impressed, and I said, fine, and the next week I brought in every one of my bills, and we went through my actual bills, and at the end of that discussion, they were pretty amazed. What struck me was they had taken no courses. They had had no education. My son, I'm ashamed to say it, is 21 years old, and it was only a couple of years ago that he actually sat down and started to figure out how to write a check and how to keep a budget. It's a huge gap in our educational background. And when you have the U.S. Congress voting for an economic stimulus package that borrows $160 billion against the national debt for the stimulus package, you pretty much communicate to America's youth, it's okay. Put it on the card. It's not a big deal. Pay it down the road. There has to be a fundamental shift in how we do that business of the state over the next several years. And I'll tell you, one of the ways to start is to come up with a coherent plan to pay down the national debt, because it will be painful. And in that painful process, we will communicate to our youth, this is how painful it is when you get yourself in too much debt.
I want to be really clear that I don't think it's people's failure to save that has gotten us into this economic crisis. I think that people are struggling, and they have been, in many instances with this subprime crisis, subprime mortgage crisis, misled. And I think it's very important that as we're asking people to save and to make wise financial decisions, that we've got to do something about the rules that we're applying to lenders and to fiscal institutions so that people are not caught in the fine print. Now, that said, you went on to ask about how to encourage people to save, and I think that just as we want the nation to be fiscally responsible, we all want to be financially responsible citizens and do well by our families. And what I think is that I've seen as the most promising initiative in that area is making it easier for people to save, to put aside money for retirement, which is a huge issue for our nation. And the way that we've proceeded with that, or what's being encouraged, is to allow people to have removed from their paychecks money to go into savings. They do that by, they can opt out of that withholding, and when they're asked to opt out rather than opt in, many, many more people participate. We've seen an expansion of savings in that regard. I think that's very promising, and we want to encourage it.
Thanks, Sam. Your second question.